Hello everyone! Today we are going to explore how the peace treaties imposed on the defeated countries at the end of World War I changed European history and, by increasing the tensions between the countries, created the premises for the beginning of World War II. Since it's almost a geography lesson, there's going to be a lot of maps today, and who doesn't love maps? We will mostly look at the defeated countries, Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and at Russia, where the empire collapsed after the revolution, with effects that were similar to those of a military defeat, ultimately in terms of lost territory. So what are we going to look at? First, we're going to look at Europe before the war, then we're going to focus on Germany, Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and then we're going to answer today's question, which is how did borders in Europe change after World War I? As you can see here in the structure is very simple. You got an introduction, then country by country, and finally some concluding remarks. Moving on. Let's start by looking at Europe before the war and how the situation changed. Now look at these two maps. The one above shows Europe in 1914 and the other shows Europe in 1919, after World War I. There are too many differences in the map to be properly explained here, but the most evident ones are the following. First of all, in 1914, Eastern Europe was ruled by two big empires, the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As we said many times before, these two countries were multinational empires, in that they contained a multitude, a huge number of different peoples who often wanted to have their own independent countries. Second point, in 1919, as you can see, these two empires are gone, and instead of them there is a mosaic of smaller national states, like Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland and Yugoslavia. As you can see, Yugoslavia technically was the kingdom of the Serbians, the Bosnians and the Croats, but we all call it Yugoslavia anyway. Another important change, which we will not tackle in this lesson, since we'll look at what happened to the defeated countries, was that Britain lost Ireland, which became a free state, independent from the British Empire. France and Italy also gained territories, as you can see here in the map. France gained Alsace and Lorraine at the border with Germany, and Italy got Trentino, Trieste, Istria and Dalmatia from the Austrian Empire, those areas there in the circle. Now, we have already discussed Germany quite a lot, but repeating always helps. Very briefly, look at the map. The areas in light blue were those lost by Germany. As you can see, a lot of territory went to Poland and Lithuania to the east, some went to France to the west. An important area of the country, the Ireland, was demilitarized, meaning that the German army was not allowed to set foot in there. This was requested by France because it wanted to avoid a repeat of the invasion of 1870 and then of 1914, which is exactly what happened again when Germany remilitarized the Ireland in 1935 and used it as its base of operation to invade and completely defeat France in 1940. So after dealing very quickly with Germany, which we have looked at already, let's look at the Russian Empire. Now, Russia technically was in the winning alliance, but it still lost a lot of territories because of the collapse of the government after the Russian Revolution in 1917. Now, initially, these lands went to Germany after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty of 1918, because Germany was still fighting against Russia and invaded Russia as soon as they saw that a revolution was brewing and bringing the country on the verge of collapse. And in fact, Germany itself had worked to cause the Russian Revolution in the first place by taking Vladimir Lenin, who was a communist revolutionary, was exiled in Switzerland, and by train taking him all the way to Russia. Now, after the war, these territories would be granted independence as the following countries: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and all the Baltic states, Finland, the Ukraine, and Poland, which became even bigger with the land taken from Germany and Austria. Now, the loss of territory had very important consequences for European and world history. It's not just changes on the map, it's what do these changes on the map mean? So Russia, which was now called the Soviet Union, or it would be after 1923, I believe, felt weaker and threatened. It was a pariah in the international order. What does it mean? When a country feels weak and threatened, it desperately looks for allies, for people who promises not to attack it. And it found one in Germany, of all countries. In 1939, so 20 years after the fact, and at the very beginning of World War II, actually, Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to split Poland between them and invade the Baltic countries. These events were the direct triggers for World War II. Another important consequence was that the borders between these new states were uncertain and very often contested. Between 1919 and 1920, Poland invaded Lithuania, and at the same time most of these new states were fighting against the Soviet Union, which wanted to recover the territories lost by the former Russian Empire. The region's instability, and that's the third point, was one of the primary causes of World War II, since it gave Germany and the Soviet Union an excuse to intervene and annex some land, breaking the balance of power in Europe. Moving on to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, if Germany and Russia had been weakened, an even worse fate awaited the Austro-Hungarian Empire: complete destruction. Look at the map here. It shows the borders of 1919, while the red line shows the border of Austria-Hungary in 1914. The empire was completely dissolved, and its territories were used to create a number of new nations. First of all, Austria and Hungary. Austria-Hungary was initially born as the Austrian Empire in the 1800s. But as the Hungarian population started becoming more vocal about wanting independence from Austria, they turned the entire country into a double monarchy, in which there was one king who ruled two countries. One was Austria and the other was Hungary, that had a separate parliament and different laws and all that. It's complicated. But some of the countries that emerged from the collapse of this empire were, first of all, Austria and Hungary, of course, but also Yugoslavia, which you can see here as the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes in the map, and Czechoslovakia, which is now divided into Czech Republic and Slovakia. The rest was given to Poland, Romania and the Ukraine. Similarly to what happened to Poland and Lithuania, these new borders were contested. People did not agree about those borders, and this caused tensions. A war, again, erupted between Romania and Hungary in 1919. Why? Because the Peace of Paris, the Treaty of Trianon, had given Transylvania, best known for being the region of Count Dracula, but also for being full of people who speak Hungarian and feel Hungarian. So this region, Transylvania, was given from Hungary to Romania. Still today, a lot of people in Transylvania speak Hungarian, and the tension between the two countries are very tense because of this. Moving on to moving on to one of my favorites, the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was not much luckier than the other empires. Its territories were divided by the winning powers, mostly France, which got Syria, as you can see here in the circle, and Britain, that got Iraq. At the border of the circle, it's not part of this map. Also, Italy got the southern coast, the part that you see with vertical stripes here in the map. Technically, Italy never occupied it. It's a long story. Essentially, Italy wanted to weaken Greece as a Mediterranean power, wanted to be the only victorious power which controlled the Mediterranean Sea, so they never really occupied or enforced their occupation of those parts of Turkey. Now, even the core heartland of the empire, Turkey, was divided between the winning powers, and a bit was given of the western coast was given to Greece, as you can see here. Western Anatolia was given to Greece, which was used to start yet another war to conquer the western coast of Turkey, where a lot of Greek-speaking people lived. We mentioned in the previous lessons the exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey. Now, as you can see from this map, the splitting of Ottoman Turkey was even deeper than that. There were parts that were given to a new Armenian state as a reparation for the Armenian genocide of 1915. Other parts were supposed to form an independent Kurdish state. Those changes, both those Armenian and Kurdish states, and the fact that the western coast was given to Greece, were very short-lived. Again, what happened? Greece started a war. They wanted to occupy all the western coast of Turkey. They wanted to occupy all those areas where Greek-speaking Christian people lived. The invasion failed dramatically at the Battle of Sakarya, and Turkey was able to ask for a new treaty. Now, there was a war. Turkey won this new war, and this new treaty was much more lenient as it granted Turkey its independence and its integrity. It is, interestingly enough, the only case where a defeated power of World War I was able to fight its way out of a humiliating peace treaty, and the Turks are understandably quite proud of this achievement. Now, in conclusion, what can we say about all these territorial changes? The first thing is that they created a number of new nations which were weaker but free, or free but weaker, depending on how you see the situation. Second, the borders between these countries were very uncertain, and many more people had to die before those borders were settled for a reasonable amount of time. Keep in mind the war between Greece and Turkey, the war between Poland and Lithuania, the war between Romania and Hungary. They are relatively minor conflict, but again, people died and governments and populations felt very strongly about it. Remember what we said about nationalism at the beginning of the 20th century. Finally, these new and very inexperienced countries, because not many people in those countries had experienced in how to run large communities, were not able to act as the powers from which they had been carved. So Hungary was no Austria-Hungary. Poland was no, the Polish ruling class did not have the same experience as those that came before them. There was no system of taxation. All the things that make up a functioning country had not been implemented yet. They didn't have time physically. And this would lead to huge difficulties in dealing with larger and aggressive neighbors, like Nazi Germany eventually, or the Soviet Union in the 1930s. So those were the facts. Now let's look at how to build an answer. So in paragraph 1 we have an introduction. What can you write in the introduction? This is a model answer. You can write: one of the main consequences of the Peace of Paris was a change in the borders between the European countries, which led to the destruction of the old multinational empires and the birth of many new nations, with the effect of causing more instability in the European continent. Second paragraph, which is going to be on Germany. We talked about Germany a lot, but we needed to include it in this lesson, so we can say: a country that was damaged by the peace, but not completely destroyed, was Germany, which lost its westernmost provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, and was forced to demilitarize the Rhineland and had to give the eastern part of its territories to the new country of Poland, which also got the important port city of Danzig. Didn't really mention, I'm sorry about that, in this video, the Danzig corridor. You should be aware of this, you should know that, because we studied it. Moving on to the third paragraph, discourse tensions that eventually led to World War II. Moving on to the next paragraph, the Russian Empire. What were the consequences of the collapse of Imperial Russia? Further to the northeast, the collapse of the Russian Empire after the Russian Revolution of 1917 led to the birth of new countries on its older borders: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia and Poland, which also gained land from Germany and Austria. The border between these new countries, however, were still uncertain, and there was a war between Poland and Lithuania that lasted until 1920. These new countries were not able to deal with the larger and aggressive neighbors, such as Germany and Russia. Austria-Hungary. How did the collapse of Austria-Hungary change Europe? Another old multinational empire that was dissolved after the war was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was split into three states of Austria, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, while its territories in the Balkans would form Yugoslavia, and those to the east went to Romania, which already existed. This was done by the Treaty of Trianon, which awarded Transylvania, a region with a strong Hungarian population, to Romania, causing a war in 1919 and tensions that last to this day. Finally, the Ottomans. What were the consequences of the fall of the Ottoman Empire? Finally, the last of the Central Powers that was dismantled was the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. Its territories in the Levant were given to Britain and France as mandates. We didn't explore the thing of mandates. Mandates were colonies granted by the League of Nations for a fixed amount of time. Essentially, they were colonies with an expiration date, which were legally allowed by an institution which did not allow colonies, but it was sort of a way France and Britain made sure that they could preserve their huge colonial empires with a semblance of international legality. So, territories in the Levant were given to Britain and France as mandates, and the original plan was to divide what was left of the country, now called Turkey, between France, Britain, Greece and Italy. Greece, however, tried to launch an invasion of Turkey in order to conquer the western coast, where a lot of Greek-speaking people lived. The invasion was a complete failure, and Turkey was able to get a new treaty which granted its independence. It was the only case in which one of the defeated powers was able to negotiate new borders, rather than being forced to accept them. In conclusion, the main result of these changes was to create a series of weak, smaller national states, instead of the old, large multinational empires. These new states were often at war with each other and were unprepared to deal with the rise of aggressive and expansionist powers like Nazi Germany in the 1930s. So, this was the end of this presentation. Thank you for watching all the way here if you did. And yes, send me your work and I'm looking forward to read it. See you next time.